The problem is that in the South that was well accepted, and the South was a peaceful movement. But in other areas, civil rights were being fought for in a different way. Take a look at letter H on the outline about civil rights in the North and the West. In a part of Los Angeles called Watts, urban riots broke out against police brutality in that region. As a result, stores were looted, people were killed, 34 had died, 11 had been injured, and Lyndon Johnson became privately offended by this whole thing because this all happened 5 days after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He felt like he had done something major for African Americans and felt kind of betrayed that this was what would follow. Unfortunately, this was a trend that would happen in a lot of urban areas outside of the Southeast during the Civil Rights Movement because a lot of civil rights leaders basically felt that Martin Luther King was too accommodating to whites. They said, we don't want to integrate with whites. We just want to become stronger and do our own thing. Martin Luther King was preaching peace and civil disobedience and saying, turn the other cheek. Well, other people were saying, if I turn the other cheek, then you'll slap me again. If I slap you back, you won't slap me again. And as a result, in the only public meeting between the two, Malcolm X, over here on the right, met Martin Luther King. And it was a lot of leaders like Malcolm X who were saying, I don't agree with what King is doing. He's being too soft. Let's take a more militant approach. And you're going to see this trend get a little bit bigger throughout the 1960s as well. Now, Malcolm X was as much a civil rights leader as Martin Luther King was in a lot of respects, but just very, very different. Malcolm X was known for his activities in northern urban areas. Now, Malcolm X had been born Malcolm Little in Nebraska, and he grew up for much of his childhood in Mason, Michigan, which has had a long history of Klan activity down in the southern Lansing, or south of Lansing, all the way over to Howell areas there. Now, his father had often spoken about Marcus Garvey, who was a black nationalist from the 1920s, if you remember, during the Harlem Renaissance, and eventually got punished by the Klan by being held down and decapitated by a train. Malcolm X's mother had been put into an asylum because she had basically lost it a little bit after her husband had passed away or been killed by the Klan. And Malcolm X himself, despite getting great grades in school as a young boy, was told, you'll never be anything more than a laborer because you're black. Now, his real name was Little, but he chose the name X because X is the unknown. And for that reason, he was saying, I don't know what my ancestry is. I've taken the name of a former slave owner in my heritage. So because of that, I refuse to be called Malcolm Little. I'm going to be called Malcolm X. Well, long before that happened, he actually joined a gang. He had a very troubled youth, as you could imagine, and was put in prison for armed robbery at the age of 20. It was while he was in prison that he read consistently, became very disciplined, became a student of Islam, and eventually joined a group called the Nation of Islam. Now, the Nation of Islam was led by this guy on the left, a guy named Elijah Muhammad, although that was a name that he had chosen for himself. And Malcolm X bought in full force to everything that Elijah was saying, and eventually became the second in command of the Nation of Islam. That, in effect, made him the face of the Nation of Islam from 1952 to 1964. He became the editor of their newspaper, and he was the one that was seen on television and in the press all the time making statements on behalf of the Nation of Islam, not Elijah Muhammad. What Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam were preaching was black separatism and black supremacy or superiority. Martin Luther King was saying, let's find a way to integrate and live within white society as equals. Malcolm X wasn't saying that. He was saying, let's break away, let's do our own thing, and let's show that we are superior to whites. A white volunteer even offered to help him out because he believed in, or she believed in his cause, and he said, get away from me, white devil. One of his things that he repeated often was that he felt white men were the devil, and he held on to that tactic for quite a number of years. But eventually, Malcolm X felt like what the Nation of Islam was preaching was not what Islam was supposed to be. And he found this out when he took the pilgrimage to Mecca in the Middle East, which is something that every Muslim is supposed to do in their lifetime. It was during that time that he saw many whites who were Muslim and many whites who were practicing the same beliefs he was, and he didn't even acknowledge or consider that that could have been possible. It was after he came back from that trip that he decided to soften his stance quite a bit and say that what the Nation of Islam was saying about black separatism and whites being the devil wasn't necessarily true, and he wanted to practice more traditional Islam, which of course raised some eyebrows in the Nation of Islam itself. What also didn't help was that he had found out that Elijah Muhammad had fathered 8 illegitimate children with various secretaries within the Nation of Islam, and that kind of crumbled the trust that he'd had in Elijah Muhammad, and made him change his mind about a lot of things and leave the Nation of Islam and publicly start to question it. As a result, the Nation of Islam came after him. While Malcolm X was giving a speech in Harlem in 1965, somebody in the audience yelled, "Get your hand out of my pocket," indicating that a pickpocket was in the crowd. And while the crowd was distracted and looking at this guy, 3 assassins from the Nation of Islam ran up to the stage and gunned Malcolm X down. The civil rights movement in the North had lost one of its greatest leaders, whether you agreed with his politics or not. But the assassination of Malcolm X didn't end the idea of more forceful action in trying to gain equal rights for African Americans, or separating altogether and proving that they were superior. This organization here was known as the Black Panthers, and they were essentially a militant black army, if you want to call it that. They considered themselves to be the special forces of the civil rights movement, if you will, because of the berets that they would wear on their head. Now, in Vietnam, the Green Berets were a special forces unit, and the Green Beret became a symbol of honor. The Black Panthers wore the Black Berets and dressed, as you can see here, in mostly black, and in a lot of ways it was kind of intimidating to people. The Black Panthers had been founded by 2 people, Huey Newton over here on the right, and Bobby Seale here on the left. And when these 2 guys started the Black Panther Party, they were basically doing it from the standpoint of, I'm not just going to get put in jail if you shoot at me. If you shoot at me, I'm going to shoot back. Now, as you can imagine, this had federal authorities, the FBI, all over them all the time, to the point where they were jailed very frequently. This is a parade that was held to free Huey, as you can see on the banners, when Huey Newton got arrested. And the Black Panthers also advocated a special kind of pride in black communities. They often did educational programs and community breakfasts for black youth, but you counter that with the fact that they were willing to raise guns and stage protests and dare anybody to come near them and give them problems. Now, they had free speech rights to do these things, but as you can imagine, they caused a lot of consternation among white America and quite a bit of fear. Other efforts were being made to really become more militant in the search for African American rights as well. This guy's name here is Stokely Carmichael, originally from the Caribbean, who had moved to America and started what became known as the Black Power movement. One of his famous sayings was that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Martin Luther King's movement was saying, "We shall overcome," and they were singing that. Well, Stokely Carmichael was saying, no, it's not "we shall overcome," it's "we shall overrun." And he basically said, I'm not interested in being with white America. I'm interested in running white America over to get what I need to get. The Black Power movement that Stokely Carmichael advocated for became very popular, and the raised fist became very popular as a symbol of the movement in many urban areas and in many ages of African Americans as a newfound source of pride. It even reached the Olympics when the gold medalist and the bronze medalist in the long jump got on the stand and had skin-tight black gloves in their pockets. And when the national anthem for their country was played, they put the skin-tight black gloves on and gave the symbol of the Black Power movement. As you can imagine, this is in 1968 in Mexico City. As you can imagine, this was quite controversial. But it wasn't just Malcolm X or the Black Panthers or the Black Power movement that was creating adding to the tension of the 1960s. Remember, this is a time of all the anti-war protest movements and the counterculture and everything else. During this time, we also started seeing a lot of urban riots. Now, they had happened in cities before, But in the 1960s, it became very prevalent as you started seeing race riots in Newark, New Jersey, that left 25 people dead. And Detroit, which unfortunately has had a long history of race riots and things like that. Detroit in 1967 again became the site of a national media attention spree and also the cover of Time magazine when riots broke out. Now, at first, the police thought they could handle it, and unfortunately, the situation kept getting increasingly out of hand to the point where George Romney, the governor of the state and the father of 2012 presidential candidate Mitt Romney, decided to call in the National Guard and ask federal troops to come in, declaring a state, or asking the president to declare a state of emergency in Michigan to calm the riots down. Eventually that worked, but like previous riots that had happened in Detroit, it left things in shambles. So by the time you get to the late 1960s, the civil rights movement has decidedly changed from the mid 1950s of let's just start organizing into let's start fighting back and shooting if we need to and getting violent if that's what it takes. That's an extraordinary step to take over the course of 13 years, and the turning point of this starts happening at the beginning of the decade with the sit-ins of the 1960s. Okay, we'll take a look at Objective 3, and thanks for listening.